Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the editor of comics like Lazarus, The Old Guard, and Black Magick. It's Alejandro Arbona. Thanks for coming on, Alejandro.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to be talking about all kinds of things today, including a whole lot about your work editing variant titles like Greg Rucka's, what he's working on, the new Ghost in the Shell anthology you edited that's coming out in this September, right?
Yeah, it's September.
And a whole lot more. But I want to start with the most obvious place for me to start if you know a little bit about me. And that's your time at Wizard Magazine. That was, from 2004 to 2006, you were a contributing editor there. I'm kind of curious, I don't know if you were in comics before that, but how did that gig come together? And what exactly did being a contributing editor entail?
It's first of all, you did your homework. I can't believe you got the dates and everything and my job title accurately. You really checked me out.
I'm a research man.
Yeah, obviously. No, I'm glad you asked that because it's actually a funny story about how to break into comics or how to break into any career, really. Mm-hmm. I had been at that time in my life, I was in my early 20s, and I was sort of finding my career and working in different things, and I was doing a little bit of freelance work in publishing. I was also doing some work in advertising and film and weird assorted things like that. Mm-hmm. And I had this idea out of the blue that I could work in comics. And at that time I had been, I grew up reading comics like so many of us. But when I left home to go to college, I just kind of fell off. It was too much of an expense. It was too much of a space commitment. I was going to be living in a dorm and in an apartment in New York City. I wasn't going to be able to spend that kind of money or have that kind of space for all these comics. So I just really stopped. Mm-hmm. And so in 2003, 2004, this idea entered my brain like a flash of man, maybe I could work in comics. And I did. I hesitate to. I don't know if I should even tell this story because it is perhaps inviting the publishers to receive a lot of really obtrusive. Anyway, one way to break into a career is to figure out a way that you could be obtrusive and get yourself noticed or whatever. That's terrible advice. I don't want to encourage people to do this, but the thing that I did at that time was I basically just figured out a way to email a bunch of people who work in comics directly. Mm-hmm. And it's not, I think anyone would have a similar idea. It's not hard to figure out what people's email addresses are. Mm-hmm. When you work at a company, your email follows a certain format. So I basically just emailed Joe Quesada, who at that time was editor-in-chief at Marvel. And I emailed Dan Buckley, who was the publisher at Marvel. And I emailed Dan DiDio at DC. And I just here's the flip side. That's perhaps the obtrusive, potentially pestering thing to do. But what I did well is that I wrote a very eloquent, I wrote a very sort of casual, approachable, eloquent cover letter sort of thing where I said, I've been doing some work in publishing and I grew up reading comics and I really love what you guys do. And I went to film school and I want to have a career in storytelling and, that sort of thing. And I basically just cold emailed these people, mm-hmm. and it worked. They all replied to me.
Wow!
Within the day, Dan DiDio replied the same day and invited me to come to DC and have a meeting.
I just want to say really quick, I'm amazed you got a hold of Dan Buckley because this is a stupid thing, but this is one of those things that my brain does. For a while, I actually thought Dan Buckley wasn't a real person because I'd never seen a photo of him or anything interviewed with him, and now he's kind of appeared a little bit. But I was like, what if Dan Buckley's not real? He's not a real person. Anyways.
Well, I can attest, not only is he a real person, he's a lovely person. He's a really nice guy. So yeah, he sent me back a very pleasant email that was just very polite. It was just sort of thank you for this message. We're not really hiring, but I'll keep you in mind and whatever. And then that was only about opening a door. The same thing happened at DC. Dan DiDio responded very positively to my email. And he had me come in for meetings and stuff, but then of course they didn't have openings, so I just came in and met with him and a couple of other editors, and then went on my way. And then what is there, a marching? Can you hear that?
Yeah, that was amazing.
It sounds like there's a second line outside my apartment.
This is
humid.
What's that?
It's so humid in New York City that it has turned into New Orleans, Louisiana.
Oh my God, this is an off-panel first. We have never had a marching band on the show before. Incredible.
I have no idea. Yeah, I have no idea what's going on. Anyway, I wanted to address it in case your listeners can hear it, so it doesn't seem weird.
Thank you for addressing it. I appreciate it.
Um, but yeah, so anyway, so then the funny thing of your question was how I ended up at Wizard.
Yeah.
So like I mentioned, I hadn't been reading comics at that time. I was kind of out of the loop. So I had this luck emailing these people, and I got, got my calls returned, so to speak, and I got to go in for meetings. But then I wasn't really up to speed on what was going on in the comics.
Hmm.
So I figured I have to do some homework. So I went to a comic shop and I bought like the last couple of issues of Wizard magazine,
Hmm.
and I brought them home and I like read through them, and I bought some comics and stuff and kind of tried to get up to speed. But when I was looking at Wizard magazine, I noticed that they have job listings like right there in the magazine. They're like, "We're hiring. Send your resume to here." And I was like, "Oh, that could be cool." So I sent it there, and of course that got me a meeting also.
Hmm.
But then they hired me right away. I went and had a couple of interviews and then got hired. And yeah, so as I said, I had just been doing a little bit of work in publishing, where I was doing a little bit of sort of like I was trying to become a writer, so I was trying to do some like copywriting stuff for magazines and stuff. Not really advancing my career a lot yet. But then when I came in the door at Wizard, to answer the second half of your question, they hired me as a consulting editor, or as a I'm sorry, contributing editor.
Hmm.
Uh, I think in fact my exact job title was, I think it was associate editor. And they also, yeah, associate editor, contributing editor, which meant that I was editor of a lot of magazine articles. I was editing news and feature stories and things like that. But I would also write things from time to time. So I wrote a lot of columns. Occasionally, I would write feature articles. I would conduct interviews, things like that.
I do want to say that you actually had one of the holy grail experiences for someone who interviews people in comics, in that you interviewed Alan Moore, which is incredible.
More.
I have to ask, what was that like?
That was that was incredible. Alan Moore is so friendly, and he's so pleasant to talk to on the phone. And we spoke for something like an hour and a half. We filled up like an entire tape. I had, this was in the days of analog audio tape,
Hmm.
and I had a little tape recorder that you would hook up to a phone. And at one point, I had to ask him to pause so I could flip sides on the tape. We filled up both sides, and I think it was a 90-minute tape, so that's how long we spoke for.
Hmm.
But you would ask him a question, and he would immediately launch into a very, very well-reasoned, complex, thought-out answer that he would speak for like 10, 15 minutes straight. Uh, but it was as if he'd sat down and composed an essay. It had a clear through line.
Yeah.
It was perfectly edited thing that he was saying, apparently off the cuff. I mean, maybe he's thought through a lot of what he's going to talk about when he does interviews for a work of his.
Hmm.
Um, but he would give all these wonderful answers, and then at the end he would always sort of circle back and touch on the main theme again and say, and that's an answer to your question, etc. And we spoke for about 90 minutes, and then when we were done and we were getting off the phone, I said, well, thank you so much for speaking. And he said, no, thank you, Alejandro. And I was like, he remembers my name. After all this time, that's the first time, like, he said my name when we said hello, and then he didn't mention it again until the very end. So I thought, as far as interviews go, that's being a good interview subject. I think he probably wrote down, I assume he must have written down like the name of the person he was speaking to, etc., so that he could touch on it. I do always point out, however, and this is throwing some shade here. I did unearth a bombshell in that interview,
Hmm.
which I've never publicized it or anything because it's petty and it's stupid. But I asked him a tough question and he gave me an answer. And then a few years later, he reversed himself on that position. And I would tell friends of mine, like, "Oh, I have him on record saying the opposite."
What was
But
it?
uh, oh, I don't know. Should I tell this story on the record?
I,
I
I
mean,
I mean, it is. It sounds like it is public record if you just had a Wizard magazine and read Alan Moore's interviews.
yeah, but I didn't include that in the final.
Oh, okay. No,
For 90 minutes, I didn't use all the material.
no. That's okay then. Although I am going to now be curious for the rest of the podcast as to what was going on.
I could tell it to you later.
Oh, that sounds good. Yeah. All right, that's great. But I did want to ask, like, one other thing about Wizard that was, I grew up reading Wizard, and once upon a time, I was actually starting to work on like an oral history of the magazine. And from what I could tell, your time there was, I don't know. I guess it was. I don't know if I want to say it was weird, but it was like when it was starting to get kind of weird. Despite people like Sean T. Collins, Alex Segura, Ricky Purdon, Ryan Penagos, Mel Kalo being there, like there was a lot of people who were like names in comics there. Not even mentioning people like Pat McCollum and Brian Cunningham who are at DC
Yeah,
now.
and
Like
Mike
what?
Cotton.
And Mike Cotton. Yeah, it was funny. I was reading that DC Nation magazine that they do now, which is very wizard like.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reading this article and I was like, who did this article? And I was like, oh, it's Mike Cotton. That's really funny.
Mm-hmm. And the design on that DC Nation stuff, if I'm not mistaken, is done by Steve Blackwell, who used to be the head of design at Wizard.
Wow, that's crazy. But so what was that experience like? You were only there for a short time before you went to Marvel, but was it a good experience or what?
It was good. It was both good and bad. You use the word weird to describe it. It definitely was weird.
Mm-hmm.
We all know how Wizard ended up. They had a long, long period of attrition of like weekly layoffs and canceling magazines and losing readership and all of that. And you're right. The 2 years that I was there was when that was really just beginning, or maybe it was already underway, but it really sped up a lot after that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was good and it was bad. It was bad in a lot of ways because it was kind of a sort of frustrating job. There was a lot of all of us who worked there together, who were the editors and writers together, we all really loved comics and we all really had very good taste, I think, in comics, and we all liked really interesting, unique work.
Mm-hmm.
But then a lot of that had to sort of be sublimated and mutated in service of
What
doing this
sells?
kind of like chummy clubhouse
Mm,
boys club kind of magazine, which wasn't really, it was the voice of the magazine, but it wasn't really necessarily all of our taste or all of our what we would like to do. Like one particular sticking point for me when I worked there is that I wanted us to do a lot more industry coverage, and I wanted us to cover comics as an industry and as an art form a lot more.
yeah.
And it always felt like we were covering the fictional events of comics as if they were news.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can imagine, you remember any issue of Wizard, it would be like, here's what's going on in Superman's life this month.
Mm-hmm.
And but that's not to say that we didn't do that kind of coverage. We did a lot of that, like a profile of this person or that person. I remember I was the editor on a profile of Seth Fisher, the artist who
Oh yeah.
I think at that time had just died. And so Ben Morris wrote that, and we were like, that almost felt like journalism,
Mm-hmm.
like we didn't know anything about his life and we didn't know how he died. And Ben was making phone calls and asking people and speaking, in a very diplomatic, tactful, respectful way, of course. Like we weren't trying to dig dirt, but that was the rare kind of thing that we would do, like profiles of creators or what a colorist does, how coloring or inking
Right.
contributes to the artwork. That we did some of that, but I always wish we did more. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. The point was that it was an interesting job. I certainly learned a lot when I was there. It was fun. The people that I worked with, we all became very good friends.
Right.
We all stay friends to this day. I mean, all of us who were in that sort of generation of editors together, editors and writers and designers, we're still friends. We still email each other constantly, see each other a lot. So I think that ultimately that was the best of it. Even the times when it was extremely hard and extremely demoralizing, the fact that we all came through that together was a real positive for us. It was a real it really enriched our lives working there, I think.
Yeah, and it seems like obviously, when you actually got into editorial places like Marvel and Valiant, I mean, like, I'm not saying that you were just spending your whole time at Wizard building Rolodex, but it also helped that you had connections with people. Like, one thing I read was that you actually met Salvador Larroca there, right? And like that you eventually worked with him. I don't know if that's associated with you working with him on like Invincible Iron Man or anything like that, but at the same time, like that probably engendered relationships with people that you worked with later that helped out.
It's true. There were a lot of people. You're right. There were a lot of people that I knew. I mean, the 2 years that I was at Wizard, not only did I meet a lot of creators, but I also met a lot of editors at Marvel and DC.
Mm-hmm.
And so, whenever I would end up working somewhere else or going into a new workplace, I kind of already knew a lot of the people there. In fact, not to get ahead of ourselves, but when I went to work at Valiant, there was a huge overlap between Wizard people and Valiant people.
Really?
In some ways, it was yeah, yeah. Like Fred Pierce had been the president of
Oh yeah.
Wizard, and he was our president, publisher. I can't remember. No, Pat McCallum was publisher. What am I talking about? Wow, you probably know this better than I do. You've done the homework.
No, no, he was president of Valiant, and I don't remember what he was at Wizard. Honestly, like I remember he was there, but
He was
yeah,
yeah, he was on the administrative side. Like he was yeah, yes, and so of course he was there at Valiant, and then because he's very loyal to people that he works with, he also brought along a lot of the people who were, very good, talented people. So for example, I just mentioned Steve Blackwell before. After leaving Wizard, Steve moved back to Texas, where he's from, but he was doing a lot of design work freelance for Valiant, and then of course Travis Escarfullery was did a lot of the compositing and design and everything for Valiant, and he had been with us at Wizard as well.
I think that's part of the reason why I really wanted to do like the oral history piece that I briefly was working on before finding out somebody else was working on it, which that piece still has not come out. But it's just like there is like really interesting like spider webs that come from that magazine just because it did like a lot of people that are in big positions in comics started there. But
Yeah, Ricky Burden also.
yeah, exactly. So let's move on to Marvel. Marvel, though, you joined Marvel as an assistant editor in 2006 under Warren Simons, who will be a recurring character here. And you worked on some pretty incredible books. Personal favorites include like Ed Brubaker and Michael Lark's Daredevil run, Brubaker and Matt Fraction and David Aja's Immortal Iron Fist. I really like Magneto Testament by Greg Pak and Carmine Di Giandomenico. I have no idea if
Carmine.
Carmine.
Yeah.
Oh, fail.
Carmine Di Giandomenico.
There we go. A whole lot of books. You worked on some great books, but how did that come together?
It was, going back to the Wizard thing when I was, it's funny, I was talking before about some of the benefits of working at Wizard, and I had mentioned that when I got that job, I was really out of touch with comics, and comics at that time in my life were something that had been a remnant of my childhood and adolescence. And then I started to work at Wizard as a young adult, and then that's when I kind of really discovered the true craft and skill and art of comics. And so when working at Wizard, one of the benefits for me was that that's when I really fell in love with comics. Before that, what I had was nostalgia. Before that, what I had was like adolescent affection for comics that I had grown up with.
Mm-hmm.
But at Wizard, I really learned that this is a beautiful medium with a tremendous expressive power and storytelling potential. And that's when I really fell in love with making comics. So the almost the whole time I was at Wizard, which was, it was fun to work there, but it was also just like that was the job of being a professionally looking in through the glass at the people inside doing the actual fun stuff. So then I really wanted to switch over to get into the storytelling side of things. Like I really wanted to actually be in making the stories and be an editorial. So I, kept sort of like meeting people and schmoozing, like chasing opportunities until eventually after 2 years, yeah, I came over with Warren, which in hindsight was so great. It wasn't the first time that I tried to get into editorial at the publishers, but ending up in that office and working on those comics was much more rewarding in the long run than I think if I had gotten one of the previous jobs that I'd tried out for.
Mm-hmm.
Like for example, this is a funny story, but when I wasn't reading comics, I did occasionally read things here and there, and one thing I read was Batman 9 Lives by Dean Motter and Michael Lark.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, this art is incredible. I love this guy. And then when I went to interview at Marvel, Joe Quesada asked me who are some artists that I like. And I just sort of off the top of my head, the first name that came to mind was Michael Lark. And I said that without even realizing that if I got the job, I would be working on Daredevil with Michael Lark.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Joe thought that I was being phony, that I was just saying like, oh, I really love the guy that you're going to hire me to work with, sir. But no, I was like, I really like Michael Lark. I was all nervous. And then I got that job. And then, of course, I got to start working with Michael Lark right away, which was like a dream come true. I mean, one of the rare artists that I had noticed in my time away in the desert, away from comics.
Mm-hmm. I feel like, honestly, like this has come up on the podcast a few times, but I had a similar gap in reading. I think I stopped reading like junior year of college or high school, and then I started reading again like junior year of college. So there was like a 4 year gap or so, or 3 or 4 year gap. And it's just like, I do think that like for a lot of people who grew up in the maybe like late 80s, early 90s reading comics, comics were in kind of a weird time anyways, and a lot of people took those gaps, and I feel like that time away, it's like distance makes the heart grow fonder in some ways, but for me it was very much true, and when I came back I had like a different appreciation for the medium. I didn't work at Wizard though, so I didn't have that appreciation for it.
But you're right, it's true. There was so much stuff, all the excesses of the 90s were going on. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, right when I stopped reading comics was sort of when the 90s bubble was popping,
Mm-hmm.
was like when everything was going downhill. And shortly after that was when Marvel had their bankruptcy scare, and a lot of retailers were closing.
Yeah,
And so that was kind of a natural time to drift away from comics because,
it seemed like comics were dying.
yeah, well, there just wasn't a lot. There wasn't a lot going on in terms of like a very appealing stuff going on in the industry or in the stories.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I came back, I remember the first day that I started work at Wizard, they set down a huge stack of comics. I mean, like a foot and a half tall stack of comics on my desk, and they said, just spend the next day or two acclimating yourself with this stuff.
Oh my god.
Because I told them at the interview, I told them right up front, I was like, look, I haven't read comics in a while, I'm a little out of it, and they were like, that's fine, if you're a good editor and a good writer, comics you can learn.
Right.
So yeah, the very first thing they had me do was read a bunch of comics, and of course, what was coming out at that time was like, that was in the early years of Ultimate Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
It was Greg Rucka writing Wonder Woman that first time.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of stuff like that I was reading it and thinking like, oh my God, is this what comics are now? This stuff is incredible.
Yeah, I think that era was like, because it was like this sleepy period after all of that trouble, and it was like there was a lot of interesting risk taking going on, and I think it led to comics being better after that. But I read this interview with you where you described working on a comic, editing a comic, as not editing one comic, but as not as editing one project, but editing like 20 to 22 projects and a cover. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective on like what being an editor is really like. But like, so what was the experience of Marvel editorial like? And like, was it pretty similar to just how you approach everything as an editor now?
More or less. It's funny you bring that up because I do remember saying that frequently, just because of, you don't just give someone a deadline for a project and then wait for them to turn in the project like somebody writing a paper. It was a matter of like,
Pages.
you have to get all 22 pages in, or however many it is now, depending on, if it's Marvel, it's 20, if it's Image, it's 26 or whatever.
Right.
Um, but it's funny you should ask that because I wouldn't necessarily describe it that way anymore.
Interesting.
It's true. I mean, maybe that's just because I'm so much more used to it now
Mm-hmm.
that I take it all in stride. But yes, the challenge then, as I described it, was that when you're tracking a project, you have to get all of these pages in. You have to track all these deadlines. You have to get the cover done. And of course, there isn't just a single deadline. There are overlapping deadlines. You have to have a cover done in time for soliciting, which is months ahead of when you're doing the rest of the comic.
Right.
So on any given assignment, you're tracking so many moving targets. And then, of course, how one deadline changes affects how all of your other deadlines change. I think at this point, I'm so much more used to it now. Maybe I just do it a little more automatically. So now it no longer feels like, no, I wouldn't describe editing a comic as editing 20 individual projects anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But it is definitely like, it's about the coordination of lots and lots of moving parts. It's a machine that has lots of moving parts. And as the editor, you're kind of this, technician who's monitoring it and seeing how everything is working. And if one gear breaks, the next gear isn't going to spin. It isn't going to turn.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of that kind of tracking everything, and that's what's so complicated and for a lot of people overwhelming.
Yeah.
About comics.
It's a very good thing that you don't look at it that way, because with Lazarus's new quarterly approach, you'd probably want to shoot yourself with how many projects you would have going on at one time. It's 44 story pages and then like I think 64 total per issue.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know. I listened to the episode you did a while back with Greg, but I can't remember if he spoke about this in particular. But we're going to have very extensive backup sections
Yep, he did. Yeah.
that I won't go into detail about because I don't know how much of it is already public.
Well,
But yeah,
he said
we
there'd be
have.
like prose stuff, and that there'd obviously be like the letters that he had before, and there was just he went into a lot of it. But sorry, continue.
Yeah, but you see my point though. It's that yes, it's going to be now a story that is more than twice as long as an average comic book story per issue. But then on top of that, there's going to be um, a lot of other material to work with, which I was actually excited when Greg asked me to join Lazarus. I had already been working with him on and the teams on Black Magick and on the Old Guard.
Mm-hmm.
And then he asked me to join Lazarus, and he explained the change in format that was going to be coming.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very excited because I never really get to work with prose. That was a new challenge for me. That I love. I work with I edit prose sometimes for other projects for because I work freelance and I do a number of other things
Mm-hmm.
outside of comics as well. But it's not frequently that I get to really dig in and edit prose. And especially when I do, it's not fiction. It's usually nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
And even when it's fiction, it's not in these worlds of it's not the world of Lazarus or the world of whatever comic I might work on.
Right.
It's something totally unrelated. So this is going to be my first time editing prose that's in this kind of fictional world of the rest of the comic book that I'm already used to working with. So that'll be a very interesting new task before me.
Yeah, Lazarus is also a rare project that has like I'm not going to say it has like Marvel levels of continuity, but for a creator-owned project, it has a stunning amount of like established canon with the world, with like the source books and everything. Anyways, we're gonna get to that in a little bit, but I want to ask like a couple more questions about Marvel. I did, and this is a broader question. I want to ask about Warren Simons. You reported to him at Marvel. You worked with him at Valiant, and he seems like one thing I think that was kind of apparent just like looking at the two of you is it seemed like you guys had perhaps matched sensibilities. You guys had a lot of overlap in what you liked, and like the projects that came out seemed like you worked with a lot of creators that had overlap with what you also liked. What did working under Warren teach you about comics and the job as an editor?
We did definitely have our sensibilities definitely did align, but then to some degree that was also that our sensibilities aligned because he taught me everything.
Sure.
In those early days. I mean, I may have known comics from reading them, but I didn't know how to make comics. So for the first couple of years of my career, I was totally shaped by his influence and his training and the things that he was teaching me and how to tell a story, how to edit a story and all of that sort of thing. And as I came into my own, we largely did stay in the same wheelhouse because we did have very similar sensibilities, but I also started to branch out and explore the other kinds of things that I liked as well that were perhaps maybe a little different. But yeah, I'm sorry. What was your question?
Well, I was just asking, like, what did working with Warren teach you about being an editor and working in comics?
Excellent question. He really taught me the value of approaching editing as an art.
Mm.
In the sense that in the sense of reading a story and helping shape it, giving feedback to help shape it, but at the same time acknowledging that you're not the storyteller. It's the story that someone is telling. You want to help them tell the story that they want to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a real skill to do that. That's a totally different mindset from writing or from making up any kind of story yourself. But he also taught me, of course, the whole craft of, this is also a job, and
Mm-hmm.
very, very important parts of the job are like getting people paid efficiently and making sure that your freelancers know that you're in touch with them and, things like that, which are easy to overlook the importance of them,
Well, and I feel like that stuff it's like there's the technical parts of the job, the making the comics part that is obviously hugely important, but relationships are so essential to making comics, and especially when you get into the creator-owned realm. Like I think I talked to Greg about that, and it was just talking about the idea of trust and how it's essential that you can trust your collaborators. And as an editor, as a sounding board, as somebody that Greg would come to for advice or for perspective, it's like him being able to trust you is essential. And I think that comes down to those little details you're talking about. Not that you pay Greg now or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily how it works. But at the same time, like that, those relationships that you build are things that pay off later on.
It's true. Although you'd be surprised that no, I don't pay Greg, but I'm frequently in charge of like not in charge of, but I'm frequently helping track like making sure that our other contributors,
Oh, sure.
especially when we have some kind of like outside cover artist or something. Um, but yeah, but that's beside the point. But no, you're right. Yes, and there's a lot of that like one of the values of one of my assets as an editor is that if somebody hires me for their project, then as you mentioned earlier, I do also have like a stacked Rolodex, and I can come in there and, oh, we need a cover artist. Let me make some calls. Like I know all these people.
Mm-hmm.
But there is also, as you said, the being the sounding board, there was a time, I haven't done this in a little while, but I have an acquaintance who is a fifth grade teacher, and he loves comics, and he would have his students like read comics and make their own comics.
Mm.
And a mutual friend of ours introduced us, and he asked me to come in, and I did it one day every year, or a couple of days every year, where I would come in to meet this fifth grade class. And the challenge that I ran into the first time I did this was how to figure out how to explain to 11-year-olds what an editor does, especially an editor in comics. And the way I described it then, the way I figured out to describe it to 11-year-olds, was that as the editor, you are basically the reader of the comic, but you're the first reader, and you're the only reader who really gets a chance to talk back,
right?
To sort of give feedback. So yeah, in some senses, I'm like the prototypical audience, the proto audience member of the comic. But and then I read it in the script stage, and I read it or just from Greg telling it to me on the phone, telling me the story on the phone, or I read the script, or I look at the roughs as they're coming in of the art. But then I say, if this is what you're going for, I think, maybe approaching it this way would achieve that effect more efficiently, or something like that. So basically, I'm the reader, but I say, yeah, but what if you tried it like this? So I'm a mouthy reader.
I'm just going to ask one more question before we move on to all the stuff you're doing right now. There's one project I thought was particularly interesting that I read about in an interview that you had done, where it was you worked on Fantastic Four Isla de la Muerte, and its follow-ups with Tom Bieland and Juan Doe, and it's set in your home of Puerto Rico. I thought that was a really cool project because it's like that type. You don't normally have projects that you have necessarily a personal tie to in that way. And it was also it was like a project that you originally didn't come up with, but it was something you got to take over really and own it. Was that project particularly meaningful to you, given how you were able to really help put it together and where it took place?
Oh, extremely, extremely so. Extremely. Although, yeah, to tell the full story of how that came about, I don't know how much of this you're familiar with, but that was a project that actually Steve Wacker, the first issue, it was a one shot. And Steve Wacker had been talking with Tom Bieland about doing something. I think at that point, Tom had already written, I can't remember. I think Tom had just written a short or something for an anthology, or a one shot or something for Steve of something else. And then he pitched him this idea about how the Thing vacations in Puerto Rico every year. And it's his private thing that he does for himself. And he doesn't want the rest of the family to find out about it or anything. But then this one year that he goes, this crisis happens, and then the rest of the FF end up coming down, and they have this adventure. And so Steve and Tom Bieland started working on that together. And since it was set in Puerto Rico, and of course, obviously Steve knew that I was from there, he asked me if I wanted to help him out with it as assistant editor. So of course I asked Warren if he felt okay with me working on that, and Warren said yes. So of course then I started doing it. And then along the way, as we were, and then I was the one who brought Juan Doe aboard, because when Steve first asked me to work on it, they were just hammering out the story, but they didn't have an artist yet. So then I suggested Juan Doe, and we started developing it that way. And then my involvement was so close, and because I had brought in the artist and I was overseeing so much of the development, that at some point Steve just said, "This is yours. This project is yours. You handle it." And he was still overseeing it, and I think he had some kind of title on it, like senior editor or something like that. Um, but he ended up letting me take it over, which was a huge step for me. Like that wasn't the first thing that I edited by myself at Marvel, but it might have been the first thing that was very personal
Mm-hmm.
and that I felt a real sense of ownership of. And then as for what it meant to me, not only working on it, but also when it came out was, I think if I remember correctly, it came out over the holidays. So I was going to be in Puerto Rico anyway, because I usually go to visit family and everything. And so we had this huge, we organized a signing, sort of a launch party and signing at a shop in San Juan.
Mm-hmm.
And Juan Do came out and I was there and Tom Bieland was there. And it was, I mean, so many people were, the people in Puerto Rico were like coming and buying the comic and they were so excited about it. And it had
That's
been covered in
awesome.
the local paper. And a lot of people who'd never, who didn't buy comics or hadn't ever been to a comic shop would come in and ask about it. And we were signing it for people. And it was a really moving and beautiful, it was a whole weekend. I mean, we signed for like 2 straight days.
That's
I think
awesome.
we counted something, we must have signed something like 400 or 500 comics in the first day or something like that. It meant a lot to me.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, and that really speaks to like when you do something that like actually reflects an audience. Like it's pretty cool to see that happen. But I have to ask one semi-related question to that project, because I read in that interview that I read with you, you dropped something that is an absolutely like intoxicating detail to me. It's possibly the most important subject I could bring up. One of those comics featured chupacabras, and apparently your uncle was the person who coined the term chupacabra. What
Yes.
what is the story behind that? Because that is the most incredible fun fact I've ever had to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, um, yeah, a lot of people forget this or don't know this. Chupacabra became so popular throughout Latin America and in the US that a lot of people assume that it's Mexican folklore because so much of the Latino experience in the US is informed by Mexico. That I think it's only natural that people assume that. But yeah, no, it started in Puerto Rico in the mid '90s. We were having these just your typical kind of like cryptid stories. People were telling stories of livestock mutilations, and my uncle hosted a radio show, and he took a call one day, and it was a farmer saying that he had lost his goats, that they were being that they were being drained of blood,
Hmm.
that he had found these bodies. And then as he was hanging up the phone, my uncle said to him like, "Okay, well, keep an eye out for that chupacabra." Click, and like that was it. And then, but he was a satirist, and he also had a sketch comedy show on TV in Puerto Rico, which was kind of a version of like it was sort of a Daily Show type show where it was news and political satire, but there were also a lot of original sketches.
Hmm.
And they started to do tons and tons of sketches about Chupacabra. They made a lot of hay out of that,
Oh my God, that's
out of
incredible.
that story. And in part because of that, I think is why Chupacabra became so popular and memorable. And then people started selling bootleg T-shirts of the creature in Old San Juan,
Uh huh.
and things like that. And it became a really, really popular phenomenon and was never forgotten after that, and spread throughout Latin America and the U.S.
That's amazing. That's just like an incredible story. So I want to ask. We're going to move on to today's stuff, but I came across this quote that I found really fascinating. It was in that same interview in 2012, and you said that's about it for me in editing comics. You may see me pick up another gig here and there, but in general, I've decided to move on from editorial, a decision I made the day that Marvel laid me off. In fact, the very morning as soon as it happened. But here you are 6 years later, and you're doing, you're working on Lazarus, Black Magick, The Old Guard, and like an array of other books. What happened? Why did you decide to stick around in comics?
Well, it was when Marvel had a wave of layoffs in 2011. That was right at the height of um, that was right during Occupy Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it was during the we're the economic recession that we're really still seeing the effects of. The I don't know, they call it the widening gap between
Right.
rich and poor, and the shrinking of the middle class, and the all of those things were subjects that really, really outraged me and angered me at the time, and still do. In fact, even more now for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, I made a decision which is a decision that I have since put the lie to again and again. But I made a decision at that time that I would only work for myself moving forward,
Mm-hmm.
and that and at the time I felt like I was a little tired of being in comics. I felt I needed something else.
Mm-hmm.
And like that wasn't a lie. That was true. I did kind of take a vacation from comics for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
In 2012 or 2011, 2012, I started to do a lot more work in like branding and advertising, and I started to look for other freelance opportunities. And that was sort of going fine, but then 2 years passed, and what can I say? I just kind of missed comics,
Yeah.
and and of course, when you're a freelancer, there's also a lot of anxiety involved because you're constantly hustling for more work. Um, so after 2 years of being freelance, I was sort of missing a little stability.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I wanted a little more stability back in my life, and I also kind of missed comics. And that's when the call came from Valiant. I think I've talked about this before, but I actually declined job offers from Valiant a couple of times before I accepted the third time.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that was thinking, well, if I keep saying no, they're never going to call me again.
Mm-hmm.
And then part of that was also feeling like, well, enough time has passed now. I actually really would enjoy
Mm-hmm.
working on comics again. And so yeah, so then I took that job, and that was, I think, in hindsight, in the long run, it was a good career move. I wouldn't be working with Greg now if it hadn't been for working at Valiant first.
Mm-hmm.
When I worked at Valiant, I did a lot of great work that I'm proud of with Jen Van Meter, who,
Right.
we did Dr. Mirage, and that was so excellent. I was really, really happy to work with her. And then of course Jen was the one who recommended me to Greg. Greg and I don't know if he knew who I even was before that. I knew who he was, but I don't think we'd ever even met before.
Didn't you work on like one small project that Brubaker also co-wrote or something?
Yes, when I was assistant editor, he joined Ed to co-write an arc of Daredevil for 4 issues.
Mm-hmm.
And we emailed during that time, but our contact was very limited during that time. I mean,
Sure.
that was me basically just being like the assistant editor, helping to keep the machine running, and Warren editing the story. And we Greg and I actually did meet one time very, very briefly in a hotel when I worked at Wizard, but I don't know if you remember that. But yeah, then after having worked at Valiant and worked with Jen, that led to a lot of new, good, different things I felt as well. In particular, getting a chance to work with Greg now so much,
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully working with Jen again soon.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, then it happened again where after that I after Valiant I once again I said to myself, from now on I will only work for myself, and now it's been 2.5 years, almost 3 years of that, and I already feel a little restless about it again.
Mm.
So we'll see, and what else, what new projects come next.
Well, I mean, I honestly think these things are kind of a natural cycle, because it's like, I certainly wasn't implying that you were lying or anything like that. I mean, it is definitely like, we have feelings where like they come up and you just have, it's like Twitter. I mean, like I deleted Twitter off of my phone, and I was just like, I'm gonna, not use it nearly as much as I used to. And I still don't, but at the same time, it's like, it's still like a thing that kind of sticks around. And it's just like, I don't know. It is kind of like a bad relationship sometimes. I think that is most people's relationship with Twitter at this point. But, it's like these things come up where you feel like, you're going to move on, but eventually you feel the itch to come back because you did have a connection there. You felt like, like you really love comics. I think that's very clear. And so it makes sense that you would keep coming back. But I'm kind of curious, like,
I also think it is important to move away sometimes as well.
sure.
I think it's done me a lot of good, just in terms of keeping the interest alive, and in terms of like keeping me fed with fresh perspectives.
Right.
I've enjoyed having my periods of like sort of moving away from superheroes and not doing superheroes for a couple of years, and then coming back to Valiant and doing superheroes again, and then moving away from that again. And in the last 2.5 years, 3 years, I've been editing a lot of stuff, but none of it really has been superheroes.
Mm-hmm. I also feel like, tying into what you're saying, it's just like it's tough to bring really good perspective to comics if all you engage with is comics. And it's like if that's your everything, then you're just going to come from one perspective. It's like, I mean, not saying that like, I don't know. I just think it's good to have other things. Not that you have to constantly read like high literature or something like that to balance it out. But there's all kinds of other things in the world. So bringing those perspectives in helps a lot.
Absolutely.
So you worked at Valiant, you worked at Marvel, you're now doing the independent stuff. Is that role different in any tangible way than working within a company, or what is that? What's the difference like there?
The primary difference is the largest the most noticeable difference is when you're working at Marvel or at Valiant. Put it this way: when you're an editor at a work for hire company at Marvel or at Valiant, essentially you're the boss. That's an oversimplification. You're not the boss,
Right.
but you're the manager of the comics that you're editing, and you're the steward of those characters. And if a writer is doing something that doesn't suit those characters, you tell them no.
Mm-hmm.
And when you are working in, and like I said, that's an oversimplification. It's not, obviously it's not as cut and dry as all that, but that's essentially what it is. You're the steward of the characters, the steward of the world of the work for hire world.
Yeah.
When it comes to creator owned, it's the opposite. Like the owners of the creators and owners of the comic are the employers, and I'm at their service. Then they're the bosses, and I'm doing the editing. But of course, I'm never giving them instructions. I'm never saying no, you can't do this, because it's their comic. It's not mine.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't belong to the company I represent. It belongs to them. So as an editor, I do a lot of feedback on story, but it essentially amounts to advice. I sort of say, here's what I think, and here's advice. And if the writer disagrees with notes I've given on their script, they can say no, and I can say, well, it's your decision, it's your prerogative, it's your decision.
Right.
And in a perfect world, that's what you always do anyway. I mean, that's what I would do at Marvel and at Valiant, is I would give people advice on their stories, and they were mostly free to say yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
But if it ever came to a hard line, if it ever came, which is a rare occurrence, but if it ever came to a complete disagreement, which is irreconcilable, in those rare cases, the deciding the weight of the decision fell to me as an editor for a work for hire company, whereas on creator owned, the final ultimate decision belongs to the creators, and that one factor is perhaps the biggest, most important difference, is just who has the absolute bottom line decision making duty in the equation.
Mm-hmm.
But it so rarely comes to that point anyway, that it doesn't really make much of a difference day to day. Like, we've never run into that situation ever on any of the projects I've done with Greg. I've rarely ever ran into that situation in the work for hire projects to begin with. But
Yeah.
hypothetically speaking, there it is.
I imagine it would probably come up mostly in scripts where, like, let's say Jen was like, and now I'm killing Dr. Mirage. And you're like, oh, well, you can't do that. But I mean, like,
Yeah, absolutely not.
Yeah. It's like, because at that point, you're like a steward of an IP versus.
She did kill Dr. Mirage, though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, eventually.
She brought her back.
That's a perk. So I did want to ask, like, with the Rucka books, I am definitely on the record. I told Greg this, that I am a much bigger Lazarus fan than I am of the other two. And it's not to say that those other two books are bad. It's just that Lazarus feels like a different beast than the other two. And part of that comes with the fact that it is this big sprawling world, to the point where it's like so RPG, it actually has an RPG made or being made about it. But also just the fact that it has more players. Like, Eric Troutman is like a key player that, like, kind of his ideas and how he works factors in. Like, Michael factors in. How is Lazarus different from an editorial standpoint as the other two, or is that just me, like, putting my feelings upon it?
No, I think you're definitely right, but I would add for me, Lazarus is still new, so I'm still not even fully
Right.
not even fully accustomed to the experience yet. We're still just working on the first issue only since I've joined. However, you do have a point in the sense that, like, yeah, with Lazarus, there's a lot more this goes back to what you were saying earlier. With Lazarus, there's a lot more world to track.
Right.
You know, like you said earlier, that it's an almost, you know, almost like superhero comics degree of continuity.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, one of the first challenges with joining Lazarus, that wasn't the case with joining Black Magick. You know, once it was, you know, I joined Black Magick when it was already underway in its run,
Mm-hmm.
and I joined Old Guard like right at the beginning. But with neither of those did I have to come in and learn a really complicated world that I mean, I had been reading Lazarus. Don't get me wrong, I was up to speed with it, but I had to kind of like, once you start editing a project like that, all of the ins and outs of the world have to be intimately known to you. Like
Have to
I have to
memorize
be
those
able
source
to
books.
pretty much. You know, when Greg and I talk on the phone about story, and he's just mentioning this family name and that family name, and I have to be able to keep up. So I had to know all of those things without any kind of, I was like, I couldn't even take a second to be like, who were those again? Refresh my memory. Like nothing like that. So the difference of Lazarus is that I had to come in and the first thing I did was reread the 27 issues up until that point, and then 28 as soon as it came out, and like do homework, look at those source books, get myself fully up to speed, and it's a lot of material to cram into my tiny brain.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there was nothing like that. Nothing like that ever to that degree ever came up on the other projects.
Right. Yeah, and I did want to ask about the Old Guard too, because there was the big news that came out that a movie is coming from director Gina Prince Bythewood, and that of course led to questions about when the comic itself would be returning. I'm sure that's something that you can't explicitly say or anything like that, but I mean, I don't know. When did you come into that project, and like how is that project developing currently? Because it's been a bit since we've seen it.
Well, Greg, that was the first thing that I started working on with Greg,
Mm-hmm.
and of course I already knew Leo because we had worked Leandro Fernandez. We had already worked together at Marvel a couple of times. Um, but when they called me and asked me to come aboard, they didn't have an editor yet at that point, but they had already written the first, I don't know, script or two,
Mm-hmm.
and Leo was already drawing, and they already had character designs locked in. So I wasn't there at the absolute ground level um, ideation process. Uh, so there was a little bit of like jumping in, getting up to speed, but only just in terms of while the first couple of issues were being drawn.
Right.
And yeah, to answer your question now, yeah. So the movie is underway. The movie's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Gina Prince Bythewood is directing, and we are working on a sequel miniseries, a volume 2 miniseries. You're right that I can't say precisely when it's going to be coming back, in part because we're still making that decision.
Right.
We our guiding principle with all of these, when to come back from a hiatus with all of these comics is usually it's as soon as possible.
Right.
But we also want to work ahead and build up a bank of material so that we don't end up delaying or bumping out of a month. We want to come out and keep it monthly.
Yeah, you don't want to come
But
out of
of
a
course,
hiatus and go into a hiatus.
yeah, exactly. So now we're surprisingly pretty far ahead in terms of the volume 2 miniseries.
Mm-hmm.
Leo's underway. I can't tell you exactly how much is done, but we've got a good chunk done. Now we're contemplating a decision of, do we release this material as quickly as possible?
Mm-hmm.
Which is to say, do we start releasing this new miniseries at the end of this year or something, or early next year? Or do we want to have it coincide with the movie in some way?
Mm-hmm.
And, that decision isn't fully made. We still go back and forth on it a lot. The most important thing is that we want to come out and ship monthly,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what. And when you're coordinating between 3 comics that Greg is writing, that becomes surprisingly complicated.
Yeah.
But what we're probably going to do, I think it's safe enough to say, what we're probably going to do is that we're going to come out soonish,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll come out monthly for 5 months, another 5-issue miniseries, and then there'll probably be a volume 2 trade,
Mm-hmm.
like probably around the time of the movie.
Yeah, that makes sense.
which will presumably be at some point next year, within a certain action movie oriented season perhaps, but that's not certain yet.
All right, so I want to ask about a couple other projects you worked on before jumping into 5 questions about Alejandro Arbona, the person. The one other thing you've been working on was you're editing a Ghost in the Shell anthology at Kodansha called Global Neural Network, which was worked on by Western creators like Alex DeCampi, Brendan Fletcher, and LRNZ. Actually, I don't know where LRNZ is from, to be honest.
He's Italian.
Okay.
Uh, he goes by the name LRNZ, which we're never sure if that's supposed to be pronounced Lorenz. We just say Lorenz, but his name
Okay.
is Lorenzo, as you could imagine.
Oh, okay, that's cool. I like. Well,
So yeah.
as a person who ran a site with no vowels in it, I appreciate him. Um, but it was reviewed and approved by Shiro Masamune himself. I read the story by Brennan and LRNZ.
Masamune.
Oh, Masamune. My apologies. I read the story by Brennan Lorenz, and it's a gorgeous, engrossing comic. I think it's fantastic. But how did that gig come together? And did part of it come together because you were a Ghost in the Shell fan yourself?
Nobody knew. The answer to that question is no, because I haven't been super vocal about Ghost in the Shell fandom. I mean, I wouldn't call myself a super fan or anything. I had read the manga, of course, and I had watched the movie in the 90s, the animated movie.
Mm-hmm.
And in other words, the only Ghost in the Shell movie that's
Right.
ever been made, of the original story. But no, that opportunity just came through, through relationships and networks, and like people knowing each other, and somebody recommended me, and they called, and they were looking they were looking to do a Western comic book thing, so they were looking for a comic book editor who knows that business, that industry. And somebody put me in touch with Ben Applegate at Penguin Random House, who was overseeing the project, and he called and he asked if this would be something I would be interested in doing. To which I, stammered and said, "Oh, yeah, of course." I mean, I've said this before. I may be repeating myself here, but when I started working in comics, I was working primarily in superheroes, as we've discussed, or image type stuff. It never ever crossed my mind that I would ever have the chance to touch something like Ghost in the Shell.
Right.
So to have this opportunity come along has been so exciting. To actually get to edit like Ghost in the Shell, like what a dream come true. That's like when you get the chance to work at Marvel and edit. Suddenly you find yourself being like, wow, I'm editing Spider-Man or something.
Right.
That's very exciting. So to find myself in that situation of like, wow, I'm actually editing. Look at this, Major Kusanagi. I'm working on stories here with the Major and Section 9 and all of that. That was tremendously exciting.
That's awesome. I do want to
Um,
say, like, I'd never seen Lorenz's stuff before, but man, that is one hell of an artist.
yes, that was Brendan Fletcher brought him to our attention.
Mm.
I hadn't seen his work either, but when we started talking with Brendan about doing a story, he said, here's the artist I want. And it was actually tricky because he was finishing a big project previously, and it didn't look like the scheduling was going to work. And even though Brendan really wanted him, and we saw the art and we wanted him, at one point we had to be like, this isn't going to work. Like we have to, tragically we have to
Move
break
on.
all of our hearts and move on and go with someone else. And then Brendan and Lorenzo both were like, no, we can do it. And we tried to calculate a very demanding. It ended up being a very demanding schedule for him because he had to finish his previous project, which ran late, which ended up taking longer and sort of eating into our projected start time. So we ended up working up a very rigorous schedule. But the man is a professional. I mean, he was reliable. He ended up jumping on it and made so much progress so fast that fortunately we our minds were put at ease and we were able to keep him aboard. And I'm so glad that it worked out that way. I'm so glad that I didn't go with my initial more like cautionary, my initial cautious nature was we're going to have to go with someone else here.
Right.
But he came through, and the work he did was so remarkable, so astonishing. That story is actually going to run last in the book, and I really love all the stories in the book, but it feels fitting that one should be last because I think it has perhaps the absolutely most over the top visuals of all of them. It's the most remarkable, like striking I don't know if I want to give anything away, but it has all these incredibly strange visuals with bodies coming apart, kind of
Mm-hmm.
like incredible high concepts, cybernetic tech kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That that all of those body mod high tech sci-fi themes of Ghost in the Shell uh, are perhaps at their strongest expression in that final story.
Yeah, yeah. You actually, I want to say, this podcast is giving me a lot of challenges in pronouncing some names. I apologize, Giannis Milano Giannis.
Uh, I'm no authority on how that name should be pronounced, but I tend to say Giannis Milana Giannis.
Okay,
So yeah, I think you got it. You got it pretty much on the money.
so the funny thing is like weirdly in my head, I always kind of felt like he would be a fit for a project like this, and he is a astonishingly great artist in my opinion, and like I love that he's on that. But so
Well, he was a huge Ghost in the Shell fan.
I'm not surprised. I am not
Yeah,
surprised.
and he does a comic of his own. I mean, he did all that really terrific work in Profit at Image, but
He had a web
he does a
comic.
comic of his own called Old City Blues, which is very
Mm-hmm.
very influenced by by Shiro and by Ghost in the Shell. So I mean, once that opportunity to work with him came along, it was a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm. The last thing I want to talk about before we move on to your stuff is you've written a book called Awesome Minds: Video Game Creators, a history. It's a history of video games for readers from 8 to 12 and up. So, what were the origins of this project? Was this something that you pursued because you're passionate about video games, or how did it come together?
No, it's a funny story. Somebody recommended me to this publisher because they were looking for a freelance editor to edit this book. And so I had a phone meeting with the director of this imprint called Duo Press. Duo Press Books is an imprint of Workman Publishing. And they do a series of books for middle grade readers called Awesome Minds, which are books about like basically to encourage kids to realize that that the things that they love are created by people,
Mm.
and that they could grow up to be creators of things as well. And they were doing a new edition in this line that was going to be a longer than the previous installments, and it was going to be about video game creators, but focusing on the entire history from the birth of video games until today. And we had a phone call to sort of talk about the project and see if I would come aboard to edit it. And the 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 publisher Mauricio was telling me, that he sort of started to walk me through their like audition process of like finding an author, and they were looking for an author. They didn't really have any viable candidates yet at that point, so he told me, if you come aboard to edit this book, you're going to help us find an author, I'm sure. And then he said, "This isn't a topic really that I'm very experienced in or that I know a lot about. Is this something that you know anything about?" And I said, "Oh yeah, no, I love the history of video games." And I just immediately started talking off the cuff. I just started rattling off stuff about like the development of Nintendo and stuff that I really, really, really love. I love old school video games. I love the history of video games.
Mm-hmm.
And I pretty much just like ran my mouth for a minute or two straight about fascinating anecdotes that I'm fond of. And after I finished talking, I paused to take a breath, and he said, "Do do you want to write this book?" And so yeah, so that was how that opportunity came about. I was so excited to get the offer,
That's
and
awesome.
then and then I had a ton of fun researching it and writing it. And the thing I'm proudest of with that book actually is that, it is written for readers age 8 to 12, but I pretty much just wrote the history of video games that I wanted to write.
Right.
I didn't shy away from any topics. Like you know, if you read the book, you'll see that I talk quite a bit about the close relationship between the history of video games and the military-industrial complex,
Mm-hmm.
and like, the Department of Defense contractors and things like that. So I pretty much wrote the history of video games as I saw it. I just made sure that it was reader friendly for kids,
Yeah.
But it's still a book that the book comes out in October, but the people who've read it so far, whether the people at the publisher or the graphic designer, or the illustrator who worked on it, apparently they've all really liked it so far. They've found it really interesting.
Yeah.
So when it comes out, I hope that adults will read it and find it interesting as well.
I've talked to a lot of librarians about what kids like, because I did this big project about like kids comics back in 2014 or 2015 for Multiversity Comics, and one thing that they always say is that the last thing kids want to do is to be talked down to. And it's like I think your approach for that is like treating them not as adults, but treating them as smart people unto themselves is like the only way you can really connect with people with younger readers like that, and especially about something about like video games where they probably have more passion and knowledge than we would ever give them like credit for. Is like it just makes it essential to approach it in that way.
Yeah, kids have a lot more. Not only are they smarter than we give them credit for, by we I mean, of course, like
The
maybe
royal
maybe
every week,
entertainment.
yeah.
Yeah, maybe society or entertainment or something. But kids are smarter than we give them credit for, and I think they're also more perceptive and they have more emotional nuance than we tend to give them credit for, or that perhaps a lot of kids' entertainment does them a disservice by overlooking that and talking down to them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there's some really exceptional kids' entertainment that is entirely aware of their rich inner lives and all of that.
Yeah, probably my true passion in life is animated movies, and so I'm very much aware of the quality. But I do want to say, like, I do want to ask actually, like, so you actually told me about some of the anecdotes you have in there, like the Nintendo PlayStation story, and then you talked about the military industrial complex and all those things like that. But I'm kind of curious, is there a anecdote you weren't able to include that you very much wanted to, but you just couldn't fit it in?
Yeah, there was a long passage that I ended up cutting for space because the manuscript that I finally turned in was something like 10,000 words over.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up having to make a lot of tough decisions in the rewrite. But toward the end of the book, I moved through the history of video games pretty much chronologically. Um, at one point I go through the entire history of the birth of video games, and then I kind of focus on arcades and video game consoles like
Mm-hmm.
the NES and Atari and the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. But then after all of that, I come to a chapter where I sort of take a leap back and start over with computers, in particular, PC games. And no, so I pretty much move through all of the book chronologically, but I'm also pursuing a through line in the whole book with building up toward a discussion of whether video games are art,
Mm-hmm.
whether which is a really thorny, difficult, vital discussion that a lot of people are having today.
Mm-hmm.
If video games are purely entertainment or purely commerce, or whether they can be considered art. And when I started that final chapter with a discussion of whether video games are art, the exhibit A that I initially wrote about was Depression Quest, the game by Zoe Quinn,
Mm.
which ended up being, and Zoe Quinn, of course, ended up being the person who, much to all of our chagrin, became the target of,
Gamergate.
the birth of Gamergate,
Mm-hmm.
and all of
Stupidity
the
and insanity.
turmoil that has, all of the troubles that have mushroomed from it. But yeah, I wrote a very, very long passage about Depression Quest and the video game as a vehicle for self-expression, and and as a vehicle for sharing your feelings with the world, and then hopefully your readers being the receiver to recognizing themselves in a video game and feeling that they're not alone,
Mm-hmm.
which is a thing that I think that game did very strongly. Um, yeah, I wanted to include that because, as I told my editor when I turned it in, I know that I said to him, I know that this is really thorny, sensitive stuff, talking about depression in a book about kids. But for a lot of kids, ages 8 to 12, that's when depression can start.
Right.
And so I really wanted to include that in the book, just so that, number one, because I think it exemplified the point I was trying to make of video games as art, as self-expression. But I also thought that maybe kids that age could read it and sort of recognize something in themselves, and if that existed in them, be able to talk about it, maybe be able to recognize feelings they were having and be able to articulate them. And then, because I was so far over the word count, I had to take a serious hard look at how I was organizing my through line and what arguments I was making, and I did end up cutting that entire passage,
Mm.
much to my own sadness. But I posted it online. I posted it on Medium as a little essay.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great.
That I'd be happy to send you the link later.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Maybe I include it with the post when this goes up. So let's close with 5 questions about Alejandro the person. And I wanted to start in the most important place in the true star of your Twitter, Charlie, your dog. Uh,
Ugh.
Charlie is maybe the most photogenic dog I've ever seen. It seems like he actually like I have a cat, and cats are I love my cat. He's an amazing cat. However, he is like he I feel like actively works against the like desire to take a photo of him. Charlie seems like almost performative for the camera. He is like a brilliant camera dog. What makes Charlie such a good boy?
Uh, I think there's a reason why pets a lot of times don't like to be photographed. And I think if you put yourself in a pet's shoes,
Oh, totally.
like, would you like to have somebody like hold something up in front of you? Like when you hold your phone or a camera up to a dog's face, you're putting it in between your face and theirs. They
Yeah,
can't see you. And it's
totally.
just as far as they know, this is just an object that you're holding out to them. So of course they kind of shy away from it. Uh, but no, I think I've figured out what makes Charlie so photogenic is that I've figured out ways to work around that. And I take a lot of pictures where he's looking at me, where he can still see my eyes when
Uh-huh.
I'm photographing. Also I get his attention with treats. That makes for a really great picture.
Oh yeah.
Get him to look at the camera with treats. There are tricks like that.
Yeah.
As for what makes him such a good boy, well, he just is. He's just the best boy.
And he hasn't even
And he's
barked during this.
No, he hasn't. He's sleeping very, very soundly. He's lying on his back, exposing his belly and genitals to the world.
Based off your
as
Twitter, it
as
seems
he
like
so
sorry, go ahead.
no, as he so often does. It's a
Yeah.
very common pose for him.
Next, I wanted to ask about a recent editing experience for you. You had a weird experience recently where you were proofreading a project in the bar, and due to light nudity, it was rather awkward. If that's a weird place to edit a bar, what's your, ideal editing setup? Like, you got a coffee in hand, you got this. What is your preferred setup for when you're editing something?
Well, when you're working in an office, it's when I work full time in an office, I'm just in the office all day. But now that I work from home, I've actually come up with a whole routine of how I manage my day, and it's in part it's to give myself a change of scenery, um, and in part it's just sort of to keep a certain routine to the day.
Sure.
But it's yeah, I like to get up in the morning. I get up at a reasonable, I get up at an hour as if I had a day job anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I'm usually at work, like I'm pretty much at work at work, so to speak, at my dining room table. But I'm at work like by 9 in the morning usually. But I tend to work at home all morning
Mm-hmm.
with, as you said, with a coffee. I get up in the morning, I water my plants, I make coffee, I eat breakfast, and I get to sit down to work. And that working from home, that is a routine like that is very, very, very important. I have found that's something that I actually didn't. That's a habit that I didn't cultivate the last time that I was freelance,
Mm.
uh, from like 2011, 2012 to 2013. During that time, my schedule was like all over the place, really scattershot, really disorganized. My hours would be set by whatever I was doing at any given time. But now this time I've fallen into this routine, and I have found it really like life changing, really sanity preserving.
Yeah.
But yeah, I get up in the morning. I have my whole little set morning routines of like watering my plants, eating breakfast, everything. Sit down to work at my computer, work on maybe, editorial work or other work or my own stuff or something. Then I usually take Charlie out for a walk around midday. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and then after that, I, drop him off at home, and then I leave the house. That's a very important thing for me that I do every day now.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's pouring rain or snowing or something, I leave the house every day.
Mm-hmm.
And then I spend the afternoon working somewhere outside of the house. So I go to a cafe, or I go to a bar, or I go to a library, or even just, or it's to a friend's house or anything. But it's just to like have a different sort of routine. Lately, I've been going to the bar more often than not, which is not ideal. um, but then it also creates something that I never knew I was even missing until I realized how nice it was, which is the feeling of coming home at the end of the day.
Yeah.
That's a feeling that you lose when you're a freelancer working from home. But by leaving the house every afternoon, I still get to come home at 6 p.m. or something like that. And that's such a nice feeling. I come home, Charlie greets me, I turn lights on, I take him out for a walk, I make dinner, and it creates a real demarcation between the previous hours, which is to say the workday, and the hours that follow, which is now, now time off.
Mm-hmm.
Like come home and then work is done for the day.
Yeah.
And so yeah, to answer your question about like that kind of my ideal editorial setup, it's I basically simulate a 9 to 5 workday, even though I have no actual like 9 to 5 obligations, so to speak, because I don't have to report to an office.
Mm-hmm.
But I still keep myself in a real like work routine.
Mm-hmm. I think that stuff's important because the demarcation, because I think it was Chip Zdarsky that I had on my podcast, and we were talking about, how he works, and I think he has basically like his studio is set up like in a almost like a garage outside of his home, and he just basically, while it is still technically at his home, the ability to like separate that and to actually like walk to a different spot, and then like that's the workspace, and then you come back, and then you're back home, even though you're still technically home the entire time. Having that separation really allows you to put yourself in a different like mental space, and I think that's important.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's absolutely essential because even when you work in an office, a lot of times for a lot of people it can be hard to separate, work from non-work, and it can be hard to keep a healthy work-life balance.
Hmm.
And that could be the case even if you work in an office. So when you work from home, that stuff is extra perilous. But of course, you also have to be disciplined about it. Like I, there's no time of day where I ever stop checking my email. I always check my email. But if somebody emails me about work stuff at say like 10 p.m. on a Sunday, I'm not going to reply.
Right.
I'm going to leave it until 9 a.m. Monday morning,
Hmm.
And so that's a really important kind of those habits and routines are really important to cultivate and keep. And for me, working from home this time has felt so much more healthy and normal and stable than when I worked from home the last time around in between Marvel and Valiant.
Hmm.
And these routines and habits have I think have been the main reason why.
Yeah.
It's all the difference.
Yeah. So next, your current home is New York City, a rather notable comic town. That said, it's not your original home, so you probably still have somewhat of like a, I don't know. I mean, I know you've lived there for a while, but like an outsider's perspective. So let's say a friend or family member comes to visit. What's the place you make sure they go before they leave? That isn't necessarily like, the Empire State Building.
Ooh, in New York City, it depends on what they like because there's such a variety of things
Yeah.
to do. Um, what a tough question. Uh, my favorite thing to do in my life is eat. So when people come to New York City, I'm like, oh, you've got to try this place and this
Yes.
place. You got to try the pizza here and the Sichuan Chinese here and like I'm all about food tourism. So
That
that might be my biggest go-to, is I start immediately rattling off all my favorite restaurants.
All right, so I'm going to give you a challenge. I love breakfast of all varieties, but I particularly enjoy breakfast burritos and like breakfast tortas, breakfast tacos, things like that. My wife is from San Antonio, so I was spoiled by being able to go down there and like try this amazing food. But what is there a good place to get a breakfast burrito that you like, or is
Yeah, Southern California.
that not New York? That-
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily want to come here for that.
yeah, that's true. That's true.
No, I'm sure there are places where that's all really good. I can't think of one offhand.
Okay,
Um,
that's fine. That was just a
I do
random
have
challenge.
I don't know about breakfast burritos and things like that, but I have favorite taco places.
Hmm.
Uh, but they're usually not restaurants. They're usually like carts and trucks and things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a really great one in Midtown, right outside the building where DC used to be before they moved to Burbank.
Mm.
And that place is, oh my God, those tacos. Mwah.
All right, I'm going to talk about another one of your great loves in life. Up next, you were recently in Puerto Rico, where you tweeted repeatedly about one of your great loves, Cerveza Medalla, which is a beer from Puerto Rico. What makes it one of your true loves in life?
Well, it's the beer I grew up with.
Yeah.
So there's that. It's like it's the taste of home is the number one thing.
Like the
I mean,
nostalgia.
it's if you're a real beer nerd, which a lot of times I am. I'm not snobby about beer, but I also have very, like I like really really strong flavored. Like I like hoppy beers and I like a lot of really strong flavored beers. And this is definitely not that.
Right.
So it seems surprising that I would like this one so much, but it's a Pilsner type beer, and it's very light
Mm-hmm.
flavor, and it's very low in alcohol. But for one thing, there's the nostalgic value of like that's the beer that I grew up drinking. Grew up, of course, like quote unquote
Right.
adolescence, not in childhood, but the drinking age in Puerto Rico is 18. So I started drinking it younger than you might have in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, and also Puerto Rico is so hot and it's so warm there and it's so humid, and then to be able to drink a really light, sort of light, low alcohol beer that you can drink in the afternoon is a great feeling.
Yeah, I mean, there is a very specific reason why Corona builds all their advertisements around beaches, and it's because it like that there is a fit. You don't want to sit there and drink a stout or something like that while you're hanging
Yeah,
out in the sun.
yeah, you don't want to drink a really hoppy 7% alcohol beer when you're sitting in the sun all afternoon.
Exactly. Yeah, you would probably feel pretty bad. But no, I saw that and it was just like it was like your temporary Charlie when you were gone from him. It was like Cerveza Medalla just started appearing all the time, and I was like, this is fantastic. Lastly, I once interviewed some of the key players over at Valiant, and I brought you up as an editor whose work I notably liked. They were excited to talk about you, but not because of your editorial skills. They wanted to highlight something I didn't know about you. You apparently are incredible at karaoke, including your rendition of Bonnie Tyler's classic Total Eclipse of the Heart in Spanish, which sounds incredible. To you, a professional, what's the key to a great karaoke performance?
Well, let me start right off the bat by saying I am a very, very, very bad singer. I'm an extremely bad singer. Whenever I do karaoke, I feel very bad because I'm subjecting the people there to my truly awful singing. But the thing is, I try to make up for it in other ways, and that is what I think ends up making a fun karaoke performance, which is that you just have to be. It takes showmanship. You have to like get up there and make it enjoyable, and people have to have fun. And I don't go for the cheap things. I don't get up there and swear or whatever, but pick out a song that people will enjoy hearing and that they'll laugh and that they'll sing along to, that they'll cheer at and things like that. And engage with the audience. I like to not just stay in one spot, but like move around the room, dance, engage with people. That makes. I mean, you have to remember that karaoke is a party. You're not there to stand in one spot and sing a song.
It's not
like
American
you're
Idol.
Celine Dion. Yeah, you're there for a party, and so like the way to make your performance fun is for everyone to have fun, and that's the key.
Yeah, that is exactly my approach too. But the fact that you did Total Eclipse of the Heart, which is just an absolute classic of a song, beautiful, amazing stuff. Was when I saw that was perfect. I do love the fact that I brought you up as like,
but it's not Total Eclipse of the Heart. It's Eclipse Total del Amor, which is a Puerto Rican song by Lizeth Alvarez, which is of course the Spanish cover of Total Eclipse of the Heart. And that's like a real move you have to know how to do, because the karaoke places don't have that song.
Right.
What I do is that I put on Total Eclipse of the Heart and then I just sing it in Spanish from memory.
I do love that I brought you up to the Valiant people. I think it was like Warren, and it was Fred Pierce, and it was Dinesh, and it was Hunter Goranson, and like immediately it was just like, oh, karaoke, and I was just like, oh my god, you must be very well known for this.
Was that at a panel? Was that
No. I actually interviewed all four of them on the phone back in like 2014. Or I think it was 2014.
Oh, I must have missed that.
Yeah. It was for Multiversity Comics. It ended up being like a something in print and everything. But yeah, that came up. But Alejandro, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about your career, everything you've done, karaoke. I appreciate you taking the time.
No, please. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with editor Alejandro Arbona. You can find him on Twitter at AlejandroBot, and his work in comics like Lazarus, The Old Guard, Black Magick, and Ghost in the Shell Global Neural Network, as well as his upcoming book, Awesome Minds, Video Game Creators. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support the show, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to exclusive written and audio content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher, and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find it on social media as well. Like it on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD. Follow it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Greg Lockard, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Sevy, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Paletto, Dylan Campbell, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Michael Garland, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Mike Gillis, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Dan Guarino, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Henning Allers, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Abraham Reisman, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, Darren Neely, John Hendrick, Steve Anderson, Phil Nall, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Highfield, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Avnet, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from the album Volmilch opens and closes the show. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.